The next talk is by Cath on the plastics and biodiversity changes. And I've known Cath for some time. And unfortunately, whenever she gives a talk, I have a really bad conscience because I worry that some of those plastics are mine. But Cath, please tell us about plastics and biodiversity.
Thanks, Terry.
So you should not have.
You don't have your microphone on, yeah, because you have one there. Right?
Okay,
Yes.
technical bit over. There we go. And let's see if I can start this as a slideshow. I've got my camera on. Great. Okay, so thanks very much, Terry. Yeah, plastics is a massive problem, and it's a very, very topical problem, I think, at the moment. We've had 2 Interact fundings so far to look at the biodiversity.
Cath, are you sharing your screen?
Oh, am I not sharing my screen? Okay. Yeah, you see, technology is not my strong point, as you may see. So there we go. Desktop, PowerPoint, there we go. Share.
Yeah, now
That's better. Okay, so now if I put that into full screen, he's laughing at me, I can see that.
Supporting you.
So we've my colleagues Hugh Griffiths and Steve Roberts at the British Antarctic Survey, we've had 2 fundings to look at biodiversity and microplastics. So we're interested in 2 things really. We're interested in obviously the microplastics, which we started thinking about in Antarctica, and we've also tried to have a look in the Arctic. But we're also interested in seeing if we can see any changes in the biodiversity, which may be due to climate change or environmental conditions changing. So that's the sort of 2 things that our projects have been aiming to try and answer those questions. As I said, we've had Interact support to do both of these projects. We went to the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources in Nuuk, and went to Cobbesfjord, which is quite a sort of remote place relative to the city centre, and the Arctic station up in Disco Island. And then the second campaign, we went to Iceland. We went to the field station at Rif, so right at the north of Iceland, and the Sudanese Science Learning Centre, so in the sort of southwest of Iceland. So we got a real range of sort of latitudinal comparisons and longitudinal comparisons between the 2 as well. Our aims were really to try and understand the intertidal ecology and look for target species that might be there that we could use as monitoring species. So things like mussels are very good for microplastics because they filter. So we wanted to sort of look to see if we could find any indicator species to try and understand the plastic loading in that and in the sediments, which would potentially be passing on the plastics up the food chain. We really wanted to compare to historic records. So we had some quite old historical records that we wanted to be able to look at and compare to see if we could see a change over time. And our approach was to try and develop methods that are easy to use and easy for other people to be able to take on board. And we was particularly interested in getting local community involvement, students, ecotourists, things like that, citizen science. So all our methods in terms of the plastic monitoring and the biodiversity changes are quite simple, and we can produce training material to help local schools and things to carry that work on. So that was really a big part of our ethos. And then we decided, after we'd been to Greenland, that it would be really useful if we could try to map over a larger scale and look at macroplastics as well as microplastics. And that's where we tried to start building in some drone surveys that I'll talk about when we get onto that a little bit later. So we sampled 21 beaches. We collected 189 quadrats. Quadrats are just sort of like little rectangular metal sort of units that you can use to accurately try and estimate what's there. We've mapped 12 beaches in Iceland by drone, and we've taken 44 sediment samples. And these samples have been incredibly useful, not just for our research, but they have been really useful because we have had master's students working on them. We've had 3 master's students. We've got a PhD student working on them. So they're really setting up other projects and other early career scientists to try and, you know, start their career in this sort of field. So our understanding was to try and establish this baseline of what's in the intertidal. So we took lots and lots of transects. As I said, a transect's just a tape line. So you can see Hugh and I here at the sort of top of the beach and the low water here. And we go down, we take 3 quadrats at the top of the beach, the middle of the beach and the low side of the beach. And we look at what sort of seaweeds were there because they're great indicators for climate change. We'd look at what sort of invertebrates were there as well to try and get a picture. And wherever we found mussels or things that that are good target organisms for plastics, we collected them as well. We only collected sort of 10 of each. We tried to minimise the environmental impact we had on the sites we sampled. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So I'm just going to play you a little video. These are, you can see the quadrat is the white thing around the side. So these are all the different sort of seaweeds that we found when we were looking at the beaches. And some of these species, one of them is an invasive in Iceland. Some of them are shifting range because the temperatures are changing. So this is just to give you an idea of the sort of biodiversity that we were seeing in both Greenland and Iceland. And some of these seaweeds, as I said, are really useful indicator species. So I think that that's just about coming round to the end of that one. Okay. Please don't go around again. So when we looked at biodiversity, particularly in Greenland, we found that the biodiversity at a particular site that we had a paper from 1993 had really much lower biodiversity when we went and sampled it than they reported in that study. And there may be several reasons for that, but one of them potentially being, you know, whether it's the spring tide or a neap tide, but we think there may well be a loss of biodiversity there because of the warming. We found Fucus serratus, which is a very common species that we get in the UK, but it's an invasive non-native species in Ireland. We found that on the beaches of southern Iceland. We didn't find it in the north, but it's definitely a species that I think needs to be monitored as an indicator of not just invasive species, but I think it's being driven by the warming. So, you know, it can make some sort of deductions about climate change as well there. As in most rocky shores that you find in Northern Europe, there was clear zonation on most beaches. So you get different animals at the top of the beach to the bottom of the beach. And they were really dominated by typical Northern Atlantic species, some of which you're seeing here. However, the distribution of them, we think, has changed over time. So the dominance of different species has changed over time. So when we turn to the microplastics and macroplastics, we wanted to record the level of macroplastic pollution because this is where we have to start dealing with the problem. Once these things break down into microplastics, it becomes phenomenally difficult to try and deal with them in either the marine or the terrestrial environment. It's much harder to get the microplastics out of a system than it is the macroplastics. So we did collect beach sediments and target organisms to try and assess the microplastics, but we also wanted to try and find a way of looking at mapping macroplastics as well. I'll talk about microplastics a little bit, what we found, and then I'll move on to the macroplastics. So we looked at microplastics in animals. This is some work by one of my students. So these are mussels that we found in Greenland. Every mussel that we looked at contained microplastic fibers, which are the grey sort of segments here, beads, which are the white component, and fragments of plastics, the blacks. Every mussel, wherever we looked in Greenland, contained microplastics. And that's from around Nook, you know, which is relatively urban, but Cobbe's Fjord round the corner, you know, is a sort of fjord-like system with very little anthropogenic activity, and the mussels in there still have the plastics, and you know, quite a lot of plastics as well. We identify them by using Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, which is FTIR for short. And what this does is basically gives you a little chemical signal, so you can try and work out, you can tell what the plastic is from the signal that it gives. So we put it in a machine, zap it, and it gives us different signals. So we can make some deductions about what the plastics are. As you can see here, we were getting fibres, so we were getting fibres. There's a red fibre up here in A1, and if you look at E3, E1 and E2, you can see little beads and fragments. So this is the sort of standard industry standard way of looking at microplastics. It's very, very time consuming. You've got to get each little microplastic off, put it on a slide, then put it into the machine. It's incredibly slow. So we started thinking about ways of trying to speed up the process. And this is some work that Steve Roberts and Hugh are doing with colleagues at Bristol University. And this is, I'm not even going to attempt to say what it is, pyrolysis. So you put your sample in the pyrolyzer here, it heats it up and it vaporizes the plastics. So you can get a quick idea of what is in that sample of sediments. You don't have to pick every plastic out, but it is a destructive technique. So this is what comes out of the machine. These are sort of things that make sure that the machine's working and are standards that it plots against. And then you look at the different chemical compounds that you get. So this compound, if you find it's indicative of polypropylene. So it's a much quicker way of doing it, but nobody else is doing this at the moment. I'm trying to find out if we can use this as a sort of much quicker, broad scale indication of pollution. We also then decided to try and assess the macroplastics. So this is Steve doing a drone footage of one of the beaches in Iceland. We've got a hyperspectral drone on there, so you can look at it in infrared, near infrared. This is a standard thing that people in terrestrial environments use to assess the health of crops and things like that. But we wanted to try to use that to see if we could do this large scale broad picture mapping. So this is the sort of light image, if you like, the normal image you would get from the drone. You can see that you've got the boulders here, you've got seaweed on these, you've got boulders behind it, you've got sand here. And we can pick that out using the normalized vegetation index, which is, as I said, a standard way of looking at this sort of thing. So we can make some broad scale sort of estimates of the sort of standing stock of algae, which again is very important when you're looking at the health of beaches. But we also were interested in seeing if we could find a way of picking out the plastics on beaches very quickly. So you can calibrate the drone, and you can look at it in different wavelengths of light. So if you look at the images on the right, this is seaweed. You can see that if you look at it using the near infrared, the seaweeds, the algae stand out really well. But if you want the plastics to stand out, if you looked at it in the green or the red sort of channels, then clearly we can pick out those plastics that come out completely different to the algae. So we should be able to, you know, we've standardized it, we've calibrated it. We should be able to use those same settings to go and survey the beaches and hopefully pick out the macroplastics that are on there really, really quickly. So there's a potential to do some really good sort of mapping and environmental assessment there. So really, just to summarize, plastic pollution has occurred at every remote location that we have looked at. It may be local, but certainly in Iceland, we were finding evidence that it had been transported there. So we were getting Cyrillic alphabet bottles and things like that. These beaches, I think, are really useful sentinels because it's changing so quickly, because we can do this, because we are finding the plastics there. And we've got these species that we've identified as good indicators, and we've sort of working on this drone technique. We think that it's a really important place to start. Not only that, the beaches are really accessible. Kids like going on beaches. It'd be great for citizen science, it'd be great for school projects. And this combination of the simple, more traditional techniques and these more modern drone techniques really has opened up how much information we can get in a relative short space of time. And I think that that's, you know, quite important. And this remote sensing, I think, is going to be something that as we move into the future, I think it's going to become more and more important, not just in terms of drones, but in terms of the satellites as they improve. So I think there's loads of stuff that we can carry on doing, hopefully with the help of Interact, to try and sort of fine tune these ideas we've got. So on behalf of Hugh and Steve and myself, we'd like to thank Interact for really giving us the opportunity. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much, Cath. I'd like to start off with questions before I come to Hannah, and that is, have you been able to look at any of the effects of the plastics on the organisms that you find them in?
No, is the short answer to that. It's a good question, and you can do it. But what you'd need to sort of do, it would require a longer time to do it. So if you want to look at, you can do things like respirometry, so you can see whether or not they're producing the same amounts of oxygen, but that would require a lab to, you know, a lab experiment. I do have a student working on this at the University of Hull, but we haven't been able to get the Greenland samples or the Iceland samples back live. So yes, you can. Yeah. We just haven't been able to.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm going to add one word as well. If you look at the Interact Science Storybook and you look at your wonderful story in that, we have extra resources which are training young kids in schools throughout the world to be kinder to the world by producing less plastic. So there is an end point, an additional point to your talk that we're trying to get at the young kids to improve their behaviour based on your story.
Fantastic, thank you. That's amazing.
Ed, please introduce yourself.
Yes, Edward Hanna, University of Lincoln, UK. I'm co-chair of CLIF as well now. I'm just asking, thanks for the very nice talk, by the way. I'm just asking about resolution of the drone imagery and how obviously you can relate large-scale patterns to quite small-scale pollutants, although obviously across quite a wide area. What's the resolution of the drone imagery? How can you reconcile that with very small scale sampling based? I guess the temporal resolution as well.
The short answer to that is I don't know, because Steve did the drone work. Is Hugh still there? Does Hugh know the answer to this?
Cath, I could answer if you want.
Oh, Steve, you're there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the resolution obviously varies depending on how high you fly it. And what we've sort of found out so far is that we need to fly it at, if we want to pick up plastics that are in the, say, tens of centimetre range, we have to fly it at maybe 10 to 15, 20 metres at highest for the drone that we're using at the moment. Obviously, you know, the sensor that we're using, the infrared sensor, is a standard kind of Sequoia sensor that has a slightly lower resolution than the optical sensor. So yeah, it's variable between sensors. It varies on the height that we fly at, but we can pick up centimeter scale material, some of which when we're flying it low enough could appear in some of the samples that we've collected as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
I had a question from Vito.
And in fact, my question was very similar, connected with the larger scale.
Okay.
Larger scale, because I imagine then the resolution will reduce a lot with the 810. And so, which are the perspectives for the large scale? Because,
Okay, thank you.
This is the problem.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Yes, I'm Joseph Noel from the European Polar Board. My question is, you observed anything to the connection between the invasive species and the plastics as a transport mechanism? So rafting or anything like that?
That's a really good question. Really good question. No, we haven't. I don't. The species that is invasive is not like a massive kelp. It's not like one of the enormous kelps that you get floating around. It's a fairly small species. So I don't think that it would. I think it would be weighed down with stuff before it got there. If you see what I mean, because they're not very big, the plants. But you know, there is the potential for not just the transmission of plastics, but of other invasive species on the algae. And that's something that we're trying to start looking at now in the Antarctic, to try and see whether or not macroalgae can, you know, bring in non-native species. Have I answered your question, or was it more about plastics?
The plastics carrying species.
The plastics carrying species. I haven't seen anything on the beaches that I can remember, and I would remember, that had anything encrusting on it. So at the moment, no.
Yeah, I back Cath up on that. The plastics we saw especially in Iceland, were mostly clean. But we saw a few of the stalked barnacles that are a pelagic species that get on the plastic at sea, and if they wash up on a beach, they die. But this is definitely a route that in the rest of the world has been identified as potential. So that's why we check out the plastics when we find them as well. So we have a look at plastics, and if we'd found something like that, we would have pickled it and brought it back with us to make sure that we could check where it came from and things. So at the moment, we haven't found the evidence, but obviously we're not covering the entire coastline and stuff, but we will report it if we find it.